you doing? Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Cohen. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Daniel, for having me and for that reading. I feel like...
Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, you'll thank me after if it goes ahead. But I feel like, you know, hearing you read back there, where they really crank the volume backstage,
yeah.
I really feel like coming out and being full Goebbels and just being, wrong answer, wrong answer, wrong answer, wrong answer. So we'll see if we get there, you know. I wanted to lay out a few things kind of in the beginning of this conversation for people who maybe aren't familiar with Pabst and with his career. Do you want to kind of lay out sort of who he was and what brings him to this meeting where he's summoned?
Yeah. Pabst, G.W. Pabst was one of the three great directors of early German silent movies, or peak German or early movies and peak silent movie, expressionist silent movie in an era where Germany made some of the defining masterpieces of the period. The
contemporaries being like Murnau and Lang.
Yes, yes. Yeah. I mean, we all know the aesthetics of those films. Like even people who are in no way film scholars know them well enough so that Robert Eggers could now do his Nosferatu and quote those images, quote that aesthetics, and people got what he was doing.
Right.
So this aesthetics was mostly created by, we could talk endlessly about was it really those three, were it a few more, but that's not the topic of my book and the topic of tonight. But Pabst was one of the great defining directors of his time. He was not he was actually very left-wing. He was called the Red Pabst. He went to Hollywood when the Nazis came to power. The studio system gave him one film to make. He could not choose anything, not the actors, not the script. He was not allowed to choose where to put the camera, and they let him edit his own film, which is pretty amazing given that he's one of the inventors of modern movie editing. Then, for reasons that we can speculate about, I mean, I'm doing that in the novel, I speculate about that fictionally, but he ended up going back first to France in 1939 and then back to Germany, actually to Austria, but that was Germany then, and ended up making films for the Nazis instead for Hollywood. They were not propaganda films, that's important. They were actually not so bad, the two surviving films, which is kind of important in this. And it's the most crazy, twisted story of an immigrant under the Nazis that I've ever heard. It's an amazing story. That's why I want to write about it.
So in that moment you're saying of you know, what you're doing as a novelist is speculating on how that repatriation to the Ostmark, let's say, happens, first to France and then to the Ostmark. And in your version of it, there is a sort of, one of my favorite characters in the book is this sort of, you know, compelling Nazi agent at a Hollywood party. You know, Billy Wilder's off in this room, someone else is spilling martinis on the grass, and this guy goes up to Pabst, who's very uncomfortable there, doesn't kind of fit in the sunshine, he feels sort of too heavy and dark.
And they both share the discomfort. So the other guy is also very
uncomfortable. Right. I mean, it's this moment where they want to share that at a party, but this man comes up to him and he says something that actually turns out to be true, which is, you will be freer to make the movies that you want to make in Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And you will be freer under the Nazis than you would be under the studio system. And that's one of the kind of interesting paradoxes that you sort of play with here, because that seems to be the inducement, and he seems to kind of believe it. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask, in terms of what you think about Pabst's relationship to America, how did he see the studio system? I mean, you talked about what his experience was, but what was his reflection on that work?
I mean, he didn't reflect much on anything. He was, even his letters, which I've read, a lot of them, the ones that are in the Deutsche Kinemathek in Berlin, they are strangely devoid of any reflection. But I mean, he did complain to Karl Zuckmayer, a German writer, not friend, but acquaintance of his, about the studio system. And I mean, if you don't actually have to read any statements of his, if you watch the one movie he made in Hollywood, it's embarrassing to watch. Knowing that one of the great masters of modern cinema has made this film, it's as if you would read some second-rate, I don't know, some really second-rate entertainment novel and someone would tell you Nabokov wrote this. It's physically painful to watch it. And he did complain about them not letting him do any of the things that for him being a director meant. But it's not, I mean, what we have to say here is that it wasn't just them treating him badly, the studio system treated all directors badly. And someone like Fritz Lang, who had this unbelievable strength and willpower, and actually, I mean, he was a terrible man. Fritz Lang was a terrible, terrible person in many ways, but he then, over a couple of years, managed to bend the studio system to his will. And someone like Pabst gave up and left, and first he didn't. So Zuckmayer speculated that the Nazis probably got in touch. I think they must have, because he did go to France to make a film that came apart, but then he went to Austria to visit family and look after his house there. And there is no way he would have done that if there wouldn't have been any communication with them, because he knew they wouldn't arrest him.
Right.
And then, of course, the war broke up and the borders were closed, or that's what he claimed. Actually, you could still go to Switzerland. So it's all literally in the fog of war. Lots of details are lost. What we know is he was there and ended up making films.
Yeah.
And one of these films called, one of the two surviving films, if you don't count Leni Riefenstahl's film Tiefland, where he was co-director for 2 weeks, it's kind of amazing if you watch Paracelsus, the first shot where you see the main character, who's a medieval doctor, you see it's a very well composed, quite beautiful shot, and in the background of a room you see a naked woman with her back to the camera, and Paracelsus as a doctor kind of having his ear with some hearing device on her back and giving her a medical exam. And you watch at that naked back and you realize he would not have been allowed to do that in Hollywood.
Right.
That would have been a complete no-go. So he did get something for...
You also couldn't have called it Paracelsus. They would have changed the title,
They would have changed the title, definitely.
Like something called Lichtspiel.
Yes.
That gets called the director here. I was watching this morning Morning Joe, which in Europe they call Morning Joe. And what was interesting was one of the hosts, you know, you could see this sort of flash, right? They wanted to use you, and all novelists would like to be used, right? To use you to talk about Trump and to talk about a current situation and to kind of project this era onto the present. But one of the hosts said, well, it seemed that this was an interesting Faustian bargain. And you could see how proud they were that they remembered Faust. It's early in the morning, so, you know, it's good. If you remember Faust before 8 a.m., it's not bad. But, and I was watching this, you know, with my Cheerios and my underwear, and I was yelling, which is what I do early in the morning, and I'm saying, no, it's not a Faustian bargain, right? Because the Faustian bargain with Faust is, you know it's Satan, the devil is the devil, and there's a contract, and they say, I get your soul and you get this, and it's done. And this is not Faustian. This is a slow series of compromises. And I wanted to sort of ask from a historical perspective, but also from the perspective of writing this novel, how did you see this idea of compromise? Was this something that he Do you think Pops thought about it as a compromise?
Yes, yes. That's basically why I wrote. Actually, and I completely agree with what you just said. If I had said that, what you just said, that would have already been longer than the interview time they gave me on Morning Show.
Yeah.
Like,
you could have just said wrong answer, wrong answer, wrong answer, and then done. Yeah.
But I mean, that's exactly the point. What happened to him, and actually to most people in the Third Reich, and I would think in most dictatorships actually, is not a Faustian bargain, where the devil shows up and gives you a contract, tells you exactly what you get for it, and then you sign with your blood.
Right.
It's just daily life instead, like a series of small everyday decisions. And I think that's exactly what happened to the historic Papst, and that's what happens to him in my novel, because it's not over. When first he doesn't want to see the minister, then they make it very clear to him that he has to see the minister, then the conversation doesn't go the way he wants to, then the minister gives him that script, then in the car to the train station, he already thinks, I'm going to slow this down, I'm going to read the script, I'm going to send them notes, we're going to have a conversation, but I'm not going to actually shoot it. No. And in the next chapter, he's already shooting it. And what happens to him then, and if you, again, this is fiction, it might have been different, but I do think a version of that happened. He's a master director. They did give him all their resources. They gave him great actors, great people to work with, actually. Mm. So he clearly enjoyed being able to do this.
Right.
And I mean, I get it.
Yeah.
I would have felt the same. It is, he gets to do what he wants, and in Hollywood he didn't. Yeah. And there is no clear moment when he signs the bargain.
Right.
It's a series of small steps, and I think that's how complicity works.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really, from my own reaction to it, from my own, reading as a writer, my answer to that kind of compromise is, well, that's what you get for being in the movies, mm-hmm. right? To make a movie requires dozens, maybe hundreds of people. I mean, maybe one of these movies requires inmates from a concentration camp to be extras, right? But to be a novelist, it's a piece of paper and a pencil, a pen that kind of works. And what you see is an enormous difference between a filmmaker who makes certain compromises and the writers who make certain compromises. And at the heart of this book is a horrible writer, right? Who is the subject, Karash, right? Who is a...
It was for a moment worried you're talking about me, but...
No, right. No, you didn't write a book called The Molander Case, right? No. Which is a sort of a sappy, romantic whodunit about a missing violin.
Which exists.
Which exists. And so, and at the heart of the book is, I guess, what could only be called Nazi book club.
Yes.
Right? I mean, which is sort of a redundancy, because I think every book club is a Nazi book club, but it's fine. Nazi book club, where no one can really give their real opinion about a book.
Yeah.
Right? And at the heart of it, I like that I'm explaining the book to you in case you don't remember, at the heart of it is this kitschy book that then becomes the basis for a movie that he makes, which is actually the only lost movie of his that's around. And so I wanted to ask about this real novelist who becomes the subject of this. Who was he?
He even has two short walk-ons.
Yeah.
He was a terrible writer. More than it's something that Papst's wife says in the book when she has to read him. It's not even bad. Yeah. And I mean, I knew that I had to engage with him because Papst's lost film, which I wanted to put in the center of the last third of the book, was based on his novel. So my only access to that lost film would be that novel it was based on. So I had to read it, and I actually tried to find ways around it because it was so uninteresting. And also, that guy became famous, and back then, he's completely forgotten now, rightly so, because he wrote a book called Parteigenosse Schmiedeke, Schmiedeke, Comrade of the Party, which is very long. It's actually interesting to read it if you really, really want to get into the mindset of early National Socialists, which you don't want to, but in that book, you cannot, which was written in 1934, it does give you an idea how people who then were fascinated by National Socialism, how they felt about it. So it's kind of interesting, but also it's 500 pages, and I actually back then...
And also how they made it acceptable to the bourgeoisie.
Yes.
Because he was a very he was that writer who sort of translated these brutish ideas for the book club environment.
You have read him, like...
Online, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't get through more than, whatever.
And not because it's bad, but because it's so not interesting. It's kind of bland. And, And of course, my point about the book club was, he had one important
we should say for 1 second, sorry. So this is a book that is assigned in a book club that Pop's wife is taking part of, and this is the way that she sort of meets all of these women in this new social circle that she's in. And they are all praising this book or saying, I like this, I like that. And she's trying to, in some way, be honest to her opinion about the book, but also fit in and not piss anyone off while they're serving desserts everywhere.
It's not just about not pissing anyone off. It's a totalitarian state. And this is a party member decorated writer.
Right.
So saying anything against him is actually dangerous.
Yeah.
Even in a book club, saying you didn't like the book, and the other women are the wives of high-ranking party officials, even this can be dangerous. And the other thing that's dangerous is you have to think about what writers are you still allowed to reference, because there's no rule book.
Right.
Things change. Like, for a while you could reference Thomas Mann and then you couldn't anymore.
Right.
For a long time you could still reference Hermann Hesse because he had gone to Switzerland before, but then not anymore. But there's no rule book and you can get in trouble for anything. So that is the interesting thing about the totalitarian state. You always have to be so careful so compromise is really daily life. But you can never consult any list of what you're allowed to do, any book, any manual. You have to always, you're always worried. You're always in danger.
Right.
And
which is a fear that also infects the very plot of the Molander book, right? Because it's in this way of, there's a mystery. And in any other kind of, in a mystery in a, non-totalitarian society, right, there would be this sort of way in which the entire society would be in some way indicted as allowing a crime like this to happen.
Yeah.
But instead, there's a very neat and sentimental resolution to this crime novel that makes it instead like a novel between a man and his son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're both Staatsanwälte, so prosecutors.
Yeah.
And the father is, of course, it's kind of interesting in terms of psychology because the father is the great person who solves everything.
Yeah.
Like most writers would have solved it differently because they have issues with their fathers, but Nazi writers don't really, which is interesting, which comes down to what Adorno writes about the authoritarian personality. They really identify with their fathers and grandfathers a lot.
Do we stop here for a second?
Yeah.
Your father was a filmmaker.
Yeah. He was a filmmaker, and I don't know about the issues I have with him. He was a wonderful person, actually. He was in a concentration, he was born in 1927, and he was in a Nazi concentration camp. And before that, he was in school in Nazi Germany. And a lot of what happens to Papst's son in the book is in school. The school environment is based on stories that my father told me about what it was like to go to school under the Nazis. In a school system that really, usually when two kids beat each other up, you think the teachers will interfere. the Nazi school system was the opposite. Kids were encouraged to beat each other up, and the teachers would not interfere because you wanted to have strong German men, soldiers actually. So the brutality everywhere, and the way, I mean, again, in a totalitarian state, all values are kind of turned on their head, and that you see that more than anywhere else in the school system.
It's Pop's son in the book who is the one who I think is most in touch with the darkest currents of National Socialist energies.
Yes.
Right? While the adults are trying to figure out what can and cannot be said at a book club, or what can and cannot be said at a production meeting, or how they deal with, what books they're going to license to make this sort of movie, and it's the kid who is sort of left to his own devices and ends up sort of at some point crawling into a cellar, which is, in some way this tunnel that brings him down into a deeply mythical German past, right? And almost something, Grimm brothers, Brothers Grimm, and something even before. And what I thought was sort of interesting about that was that it was the child who could see the root of the mythos under which they're suffering.
Yes.
And is that Pop's son?
You mean the real son?
Yeah, the real son. Yeah.
Well, the thing is this. Pabst had a real son called Peter Pabst. He actually had two sons. The other one was born in the last year of the war, so he was not part of this.
Yeah.
A lot what happens to that fictional son is kind of similar to what happened to Peter Pabst. I also read his letters, but it was really important. I did because he's the person of all the protagonists in the book who lived. He died in 1994. So just to make sure that I had not a lot of access to his inner life, I mean, other than those few letters I found, I changed the name. And then it was very important to Pabst's family, who got in touch with me after the book came out, that I made sure to say it's a fictional son, which he is, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of what actually happens to him, a lot of the stuff that happens to that fictional character in the book is inspired by things that happened to the real Peter Pabst.
Oh. Oh. I wanted to kind of take a turn for a moment and remember one of the more interesting moments in American cinema of our generation, which was, do you remember the Zero Dark 30? Do you remember that movie? Mm-hmm. And that was one of the first movies where it became more and more, the reportage came out, and it became more and more obvious what access the CIA was giving to directors.
Interesting.
In order to, right? Yes. Was the idea that there was a stealth helicopter. Right, the idea that this was something that the government had developed, and now we're suddenly seeing it in a movie, and that opened up for people like myself who don't necessarily spend all day following how the CIA infiltrates our media on a daily basis, what the sort of inflection points were in movies of our generation of the 80s and early 90s, the Cold War movies, and how the military and intelligence complex reached out to filmmakers, influenced the writing of scripts, in many ways helped and suggested subjects. And I wanted to ask, where do you feel the American culture is with regard to this type of opportunistic compromise, right? Is it something that, it's hard to ask, we all ask outsiders questions like this, but when you come to this culture, is this something that you see that's, as I see it maybe, which has been endemic in American culture, or are you seeing it more in the Morning Yoe interpretation that this is something newly pertinent because of a Trump administration?
No, I think it always happened, but it became much more pertinent. I mean, and the movie world was very prescient here. Like the first time I was realizing that some people even thought Trump would come back was in 2021 when a friend told me that his TV show was canceled, that he had a contract to write, which was a Trump satire. And in 2021, in the spring, the streamer said, yeah, we think he's coming back, so let's not do it. So, and back then it seemed to me outlandish, but of course they turned out to be right, in their fear and opportunism. And of course, I mean, look at the last Oscar gala. All these people who love to speak about their concern for liberal politics and diversity and all the good things, and not a word from anybody except one rather lame joke, from the Canadian Martin Short. No one said anything to say. So the thing with movies is, and that's why this book couldn't have written the same way about a writer, even though writers had to make lots of compromises to be published, but still, a writer can still write their book and then negotiate, can I publish this or not? A filmmaker needs so many resources and money and wealth to be given to them to actually being able to do what they want to do in the first place. So the compromise doesn't come at the end when there's the question, am I going to publish this? It comes in the beginning. And then when you do not make those compromises, a writer can still write, like Vasily Grossman, can still write their books and hope for posterity.
Right.
A filmmaker cannot make movies and hope for posterity because you need millions to make movies. Now, some people in Iran make movies on their phones. That's a very new development, which is great, but that has not been an option for most of film history. So you can see that there's a lot of pressure that the government can put on the movie world, which is what's so amazing, again, about the Mad King of America, is that instead of using that, he just announced tariffs which will basically shut down all movies made at all.
The tariff on foreign film.
Yeah, but it's not.
Sure.
It's about films made outside of America, which is more or less all American movies. So it means, and also apart from that, we don't even understand what it means, 100% tariffs on what exactly, but instead of using power to blackmail the movies, he's just shutting down movies. It's kind of amazing.
Translations next.
Yeah,
Very easy thing to tariff.
Yeah. My translator is here. I kept making that joke. I'm sure he's already tired of hearing it. I said, we're running a trade deficit. You're translating me.
Yeah.
I haven't translated you yet. I'm translating my friend Christopher Hampton, who's translating me on the stage. So actually now my translator has to write something that I can translate, so we're avoiding the trade deficit. But yeah, I'm making all these kind of rather tired jokes. And then he announced the movie tariffs. So and I mean, correct. I'm not an economic expert, obviously, but as far as I know, a movie isn't even a good. A movie is a service.
It's a service. Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense, and it's kind of funny.
Well, again, I think
it's funny.
I think he's talking about tariffing VHS tapes.
Yeah, that's what he knows. That's what he.
Right.
And
I mean,
I mean, the great thing is that he's so bad at the dictatorship thing, which is our hope.
So I mean, you know, I see it in some of the. I think we have some similarities in the way we view it, but I tend to see that for the first term, there was no shortage of Trump critique, but all it did was serve to strengthen him. And so I wanted to
well, he lost. So I mean, in the long run, it didn't. But he did something. It did something.
But my thought during that time was about the limits of satire, the limits of parody. There's a way in which when you humiliate someone, you make fun of someone, even if it's, you know, you make them stronger. right? I mean, you see that his presidency, on one hand, can be seen as begun by, Obama's bad comedy routine at the White House press correspondents' dinner. And so I wanted to ask you about the sense of sort of parody and satire. The reason why I wanted to ask you about it is not just because of the Trump issue, but because you begin by reading this large section where it's Goebbels talking, right? Which for me, it's just funny.
Yes.
If someone's saying I'm writing Goebbels talking, it's like I'm ready for it. I'm here. And we've also gotten used to through Tarantino, right? Through Spielberg, right? These cartoon Nazis.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this parody or the sense of satire and parody, and how do you regard it as a weapon, or don't you?
I mean, I regard it. I agree with you. I'm not sure about the weapon thing. It's kind of really annoying by now to see the late night comedians. Some of them are really great. I'm not denying that at all. And the audience keeps laughing, and you feel like, why are you laughing? I mean, of course, these are good jokes, but you should be rather angry than laughing. I think showing them as ridiculous, it's not so much a weapon as it is a form of realism when things become unreal. Like, there's a line in a Voltaire, I think, letter. It's somewhere in Voltaire, and I think he made a real discovery there. He's talking about the Catholic Church, which he hated, and he calls them arlequins anthropophages, like cannibal harlequins. And cannibal harlequins is just amazing. What he means by that is people can be absolutely dangerous monsters, and at the same time, they are really ridiculous. They are absolute morons and buffoons, but they can still eat people. Like, that's what Voltaire says. And I think if you look at someone like Goebbels or Goering, probably not Hitler, which is interesting, Yanucci did something amazing with Death of Stalin. He did that in the Stalinist dictatorship. If you look at the totalitarian state, there is incredible comic potential, which doesn't mean you're making light of it, which doesn't mean you are denying the incredible brutality and bloodletting and danger of it. And I think, I would claim that term anthropophage arlequin, it captures that perfectly because that's what they are.
Right. I think that one of the sort of defining truths of our era is that something can be so entertaining and so destructive.
Yeah.
Right? And because of this sort of simultaneity of the entertainment and destructive complex, it becomes, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, it becomes more and more difficult to write about the present. Mm-hmm. The present keeps on slipping through your hands.
Yes.
And now, at this point in your career, you've written a few books in the present, but the bulk of the books, I think, especially also that an American readership would know, are historical novels. And they're historical novels that are widely dispersed from the 19th century to the 30 Years' War to now the 1940s. And I wonder why.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure this one is, in the traditional sense, a historical novel, because for me it feels so close. There are several people in the books whom my parents still knew, like among the exile writer community, and so it feels not quite historical, but it's definitely not the present. For younger people, the 1940s is definitely a historical novel. So I'm friends with Michael Haneke, the director. And every time we meet, that's mostly all we talk about. Like, how do you create art that is really about the presence? And Michael says every time he says anything historical is kind of a cop-out. It's kind of you're hiding from writing about the present. And then I always say, yeah, but what about the white ribbon? And then he says, yeah, that too. Yes, totally. I didn't want to make a film about the present, and that's a shortcoming. And I'm like, that's not a shortcoming.
Right. But hasn't he also stopped making movies?
Yeah, and one reason for that is also because he says it's very hard to do something that's really very, very relevant and not historic.
Right.
And I don't agree with that completely, but he's onto something, of course. It has become very, very, it has, or let me put it differently. It has become, the present has become so strange and fractured and multi-perspectivical, can you say that? Multi-perspective.
Sure.
That you can capture some aspects of it best by writing about the past and recreating past eras that were really different from ours. And I think that's also very important. People who say that human beings don't change much, they always remind me of people who say they don't travel because the world is the same everywhere. The more you travel, you see the world is not the same everywhere. And the more you look at history, you realize that the human soul is not a thing fixed in time. It changes profoundly, but we can learn a lot from that. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question here, but it has become harder to write about the presence than probably it was for Charles Dickens. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason I'm writing novels set in the past is just I love history.
Right.
But I'm not ready to concede yet that that's my main thing. The novel I'm working on right now is set today. And maybe people will say about my work, if they say anything about my work, that the historical books are the most relevant ones or the best ones or whatever. But I'm not ready to give up that fight yet.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wonder if it's the same reason that one would make a film about Paracelsus under the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Because it's easy to do that than to do your present in the 40s.
I mean, also, that was the only way you were allowed to do something about the present was comedy.
Right.
And so he could have chosen either comedy or something in the past.
Right.
I think you can still write about the present and it's not comedy, and there are very good examples for that. But yeah, I mean, it was a totalitarian state. You didn't get to, you had very small bandwidth to choose what you could do. I mean, I think Pabst did the Molander case because it was one of the few things that he could do that was set in the present and he didn't have to have Nazis in it.
Right.
So he did, I'm talking about the historical Pabst. So, you couldn't choose much.
So I'm going to ask the most difficult of these audience questions, and the one written with the best penmanship, and also with a great deployment of scare quotes. Is it possible to create great art, scare quotes, under the conditions of fascism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say I don't think it is. I don't think it is. There is a... it's not unthinkable. I mean, it's not inconceivable, but empirically, there is no great art that was created under fascism, so in my opinion. And I think there is a reason for that. I think in a totalitarian state, and I mean, of course, when we say fascism, that can mean a lot of things. That can also mean Perón in Argentina, and Borges did create a great body of work under Perón in Argentina. So talking about the really totalitarian state in the Hannah Arendt sense of German fascism, I think the lie permeated just everything all the time. And you didn't have any space to think free, to feel free, to be a human being. And so there's a great poem by Bert Brecht, which goes a little bit, I translate in my head, says, even if Hitler would conquer the whole earth, there couldn't be one good poem praising him. And I think that's true.
So I will ask you one more of these. What do you think happened to Pabst's lost movie?
Yeah, I think that's easy. He was editing that film, and then he had to get out of Prague fast because the Red Army was approaching Prague. And something happened in Prague, which happens in my books that I never learned about it at school. It's the Prague Uprising. Prague is the one city where before the Red Army reached Prague, the whole population did a huge uprising against the Nazis. And so in my novel that happens while Pabst is still there. In reality, he left before because the Red Army approached. And he left the movie, and it probably burned. Yeah. I mean, something that I was fascinated by is that nitrate film, on which they were filming back then, burns incredibly easy. And if once it burns, it's like a metaphor, once it burns, it cannot be extinguished. It burns all the way. Yeah. Water only makes the flame stronger. And that probably happened. Or like many things in history, just those reels were somewhere, and it was just thrown in the trash.
Yeah.
Could have happened easily.
All right. Well, I want to thank you and thank everyone for coming for this evening.
Thank you.
This is very nice. And are you signing books?
Yes, I'm signing
Daniel's
books.
going to sign books, and thank you very much. And we should say that this is the cover that you should be looking for.
This is the British cover.
This is the British cover. I thought this was a self-portrait of me, but this is the British cover. And thank you very much. This was a lovely evening.